The Assembly's diplomatic ship entered the Sol system like a man returning to a house he had burned down, wearing his best suit and carrying flowers. 60 years. That was how long the quarantine had lasted. 60 years since 312 alien species voted to lock humanity inside its own solar system, seal the borders, cut the communication lines, and file the whole thing under developmental risk management. 60 years since the stars became a ceiling. Speaker Lowen stood at the bridge of the envoy vessel, all 6 limbs folded in what passed for dignity among the Tasari. Bioluminescent patterns rippled across Lowen's skin in slow, measured waves. Calm, controlled, rehearsed. The speech was ready. The apology had been drafted by 11 committees, revised 40 times, and translated into every known human language. It was, by all accounts, a masterpiece of diplomatic regret. Then the censors picked up the fleet. Leowen's tactical officer, a broad-skulled creature from the outer colonies, made a sound that roughly translated to choking on one's own tongue. 12 ships, human ships, sitting in formation at the edge of the solar system, like dogs waiting at a fence. They were ugly. Bolted together from scavenged parts, welded seams visible even at long range, hulls patched with materials that didn't match. One of them appeared to be running its shields on a power converter that the Assembly had discontinued 40 years ago. They were also, impossibly, FTL capable. The tactical officer checked the readings 3 times, checked them a 4th time, then sat down and said nothing for a very long while. The Assembly had quarantined Earth specifically to prevent this. Humans were not supposed to have faster-than-light travel. Humans were supposed to be sitting in their little blue marble, maybe fighting over water rights, maybe building slightly better rockets, definitely not forming a functional battle formation with technology they had reverse-engineered from garbage. Captain Yun Do-hyun watched the Assembly envoy from the bridge of the UESC Baekdu. He stood with his hands behind his back, his posture the kind of still that unnerved people. Do-hyun was 41 years old. He had spent 20 of those years building this ship. Not designing it, building it, cutting metal, welding joints, sleeping in the half-finished engine bay because the funding had run out again and someone had to guard the parts from being scrapped. The Baekdu was not a beautiful ship. It flew the way a fist moves through air. But it flew. Do-hyun watched the alien vessel glide closer and felt nothing that looked like awe. He had imagined this moment for 2 decades. Most real things were. The ceremony took place on the Assembly Station orbiting Mars, a neutral site, which was a polite way of saying the Assembly didn't want to land on Earth, and the humans didn't want to let them. The chamber was wide, curved, built to hold representatives from hundreds of species. Today it held exactly 1 human delegation, seated at a table that had been added at the last minute because no one had thought to include human furniture. Speaker Lowen delivered the apology. It was, as promised, beautiful. The words rolled out in carefully modulated frequencies, translated in real time through earpieces that the human delegation wore, with the stiff politeness of people being handed participation trophies. Lowen spoke of regret, of institutional failure, of a decision made in fear that had caused immeasurable harm. The bioluminescent patterns on Lowen's skin shifted through deep blues and soft violets, colors that signified grief in Tasari culture. 312 species watched the broadcast. Commentators on a dozen worlds called it historic. No Sorin listened from the human delegation's seat. She was 44, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that looked patient, the way a locked door looks patient. She had been a labor organizer in Busan before the United Earth Council tapped her for this job. She had spent her career sitting across from people who had power over her, and making them realize they had less than they thought. She did not blink during the entire speech. When the floor was given to Earth's representative, the chamber settled into the particular silence of an audience expecting tears, or gratitude, or perhaps a trembling voice accepting the apology with grace. Sorim stood, adjusted the microphone, looked at Speaker Lyowen the way a woman looks at a bill she didn't ask for. She did not accept the apology. She did not reject it. She tabled it like an agenda item that wasn't worth the room's time yet. "You didn't come here because you're sorry," she said. Her voice was flat, conversational, the kind of tone that made powerful people lean forward. "You came because you're scared. So let's skip the part where we all pretend this is about conscience, and get to the part where you tell us what you need." The chamber did not erupt. It froze, which was worse. Speaker Lyowen, to Lyowen's credit, did not pretend. The Veil Rift briefing was delivered within the hour. A dimensional tear spreading across 6 inhabited systems, expanding, consuming. Every weapon, shield, and known law of physics had been thrown at it. Nothing worked. The Assembly's best scientists had been studying it for 11 years. They had learned exactly one thing. They could not stop it. Dr. Shin Unji received the data aboard the Baekdu. She was 36, thin, with the permanent eye bags of someone who treated sleep like a suggestion. She had spent her entire career studying alien physics she was never allowed to test. 14 published papers, 0 field experiments. Every single one of her theories built on stolen sensor readings and second-hand data smuggled through quarantine cracks. She read the Assembly's rift data in her cramped lab, surrounded by equipment held together with tape and stubbornness. Halfway through, she stopped. Read it again. Started laughing. Her assistant, a young engineer named Kwon Minji, looked up from her console with the expression of someone reconsidering her career choices. "What's funny?" Minji asked. Unji wiped her eyes, pointed at the screen. "It's not a rupture," she said. "It's not breaking through anything." "Then what is it?" Unji leaned back. The laughter had left her face. What replaced it was something older and stranger. Something that looked like recognition. "It's a knock," she said. "Something is on the other side, and it's been knocking for 11 years, and nobody thought to answer." 6,000 kilometers away, in a quiet office that smelled like cold tea, Admiral Ha Tae-gun read Yoonji's preliminary report. One line circled 3 times in red. "The rift is reactive. It responds to observation. It is not breaking through. It is waiting to be let in." He closed the file, sat still for a long time, then opened a second screen and began reassigning the entire fleet. The Baekdu dropped out of FTL into the terrain system, and Lieutenant Baek Ji-song's first thought was that the rift looked like a wound that refused to scab. It hung in space between 2 gas giants, a jagged line of wrong light stretching across 3 million kilometers. Not bright, not dark. Something in between that made the eyes water and the brain itch. The sensors couldn't agree on what color it was. Every reading came back different. Ji-song's console told him it was simultaneously ultraviolet, infrared, and a shade of blue that did not exist. He decided not to think about it too hard and focused on the 6 assembly carrier ships already holding position at the rift's edge. The joint mission was Speaker Lyowen's idea, a show of cooperation. Humanity and the Assembly, working together, equals at last. The reality, as Ji-song noted within the first 15 minutes, was that the Assembly officers treated them like rescue dogs who had wandered into a surgical theater. The lead Assembly tactical officer, a Myresi with translucent skin and too many eyes, patched into the Baekdu's communication channel and began explaining, slowly and carefully, how to maintain formation distance from a dimensional anomaly. Ji-song listened, said nothing, ran the formation maneuver at twice the recommended speed, threading the Baekdu between 2 assembly cruisers with 6 meters of clearance on each side. The communication channel went very quiet. Captain Do-hyun, standing at the center of his bridge, allowed himself something that was almost a smile. The Baekdu was not built to assembly specifications. It was built by people who had spent 60 years inventing solutions to problems they weren't supposed to know existed. Every system was a workaround. Every workaround was a small act of defiance. The ship moved like nothing the assembly had ever catalogued, because it was nothing the assembly had ever imagined. Below the bridge in her lab, Dr. Shin Eun-ji was not paying attention to formation maneuvers. She was staring at data that was making her question several things she had considered fundamental truths about the universe. The assembly had studied the rift for 11 years, using sensor arrays calibrated to the standard galactic frequency range. This was reasonable. This was also, as Eun-ji was discovering, like trying to read a book by only looking at every third page. Humans perceive time differently than every species in the assembly. Not better, not worse, differently. A quirk of neural architecture. A side effect of the way human consciousness processed sequential information. Eun-ji had built her scanner to account for this, using frequency bands that no assembly scientist would have thought to check, because no assembly scientist experienced temporal perception the way humans did. When she activated the scanner, the rift responded. Not a little, not subtly. The entire 3 million-kilometer wound reorganized itself. Patterns emerged, structures, repeating sequences that cascaded through dimensions the assembly's instruments couldn't even detect. For 11 seconds, the rift became something that looked like language. Then it stopped, settled back into chaos, waited. Eun-ji's hands were shaking. She stared at the recording of those 11 seconds, played it back, played it again. On the 14th viewing, she noticed something that made the air in her lungs feel like it belonged to someone else. The patterns weren't random. They were structured like a greeting. A very old, very patient greeting from something that had been saying hello for over a decade and had finally been heard. She reached for her communicator to call Do-hyun. Before she could, the door to her lab opened, and a hegemony agent tried to kill her career. Not literally. The agent, a compact alien with scales like dull copper, was there to steal the scan data. Eun-ji didn't know this at the time. She only knew that an unauthorized person was standing in her lab, holding a data extraction device that was definitely not standard diplomatic equipment. Ji-song was there in 40 seconds. He had been running the internal sensor feed from the bridge and noticed the unauthorized movement the way a cat notices a door opening 3 rooms away. He came through the lab entrance without announcing himself, put himself between Eun-ji and the agent, and stood there. The agent was taller, better armed, trained for infiltration by one of the assembly's most powerful military blocks. Ji-song was 28, hadn't slept in 31 hours, and had the energy of a person who had spent his entire life waiting for someone from the assembly to give him a reason. The confrontation lasted 2 minutes. No weapons fired, no voices raised. Ji-song looked at the agent with the calm attention of someone reading a menu and said, "You can walk out of here, or I can make a formal report. The formal report includes the communication logs I copied from your device while you were looking at my face." The agent walked out. Ji-song delivered the logs to No Sorum on a secure channel. She read them in her quarters on the assembly station. The logs confirmed what she had suspected. The hegemony bloc wasn't interested in closing the rift. They were interested in controlling whatever came out of it. And whoever controlled the data controlled the outcome. "Good," she said. "Now we know who's buying." She did not explain what she meant by that. Ji-song did not ask. He was learning that Sorum operated like a chess player who had already seen the end of the game and was just moving pieces to get there. At the assembly chamber, Sorum presented Eun-ji's findings to the full council. She stood at the same podium where Liawen had delivered the apology, wearing the same flat expression, carrying the same unhurried voice. She told them the rift was not random. She told them human scanners had detected patterns that assembly instruments had missed. She told them humanity had made a breakthrough. She did not tell them the rift was linguistic. She kept that part folded in her back pocket, like a card she wasn't ready to play. "We will share our complete findings," she said, "in exchange for three things: permanent repeal of quarantine authority over any species, retroactive reparations for 60 years of illegal isolation, and a human seat on the Assembly Security Council." The chamber erupted. Representatives from dozens of species began speaking at once. Leowen's bioluminescence flickered in rapid, distressed patterns. 3 hegemony delegates walked out. 2 isolationist blocs demanded emergency recess. A reformist representative from the inner worlds stood and applauded, which caused a minor diplomatic incident because applause was considered a threat display on 11-member worlds. Sorim waited. Let the noise wash over her. She had grown up organizing dock workers in Busan. She had stood in rooms full of angry men with more power than her and less patience. This was familiar. This was home. On the Baekdu, Captain Do-hyun stood alone on the bridge during night cycle. The crew was asleep. The ship was quiet. Through the main viewport, the rift pulsed in its impossible colors, and Do-hyun watched it with an expression he couldn't explain and didn't try to. It felt like recognition, like seeing handwriting you know but can't place, a familiarity that lived in the body, not the brain. He didn't report it. He just stood there, one hand on the railing his crew had welded from scrap metal, and watched the oldest door in the universe pulse in the dark. 6 hours later, the rift expanded by 40%. 3 assembly colony worlds ordered emergency evacuations. Ships scrambled. Panic spread through channels that were supposed to be encrypted, and on a frequency that only the Baekdu's hand-built sensors could detect. The rift transmitted a single pulse, repeated, steady, patient. Eunji translated it alone in her quarters at 3 in the morning, her hands wrapped around a cup of cold tea, her eyes red, her brain running on something beyond caffeine, looped. Finally, Eunji stopped sleeping. Not in the way people say they stop sleeping when they mean they slept badly. She stopped, completely. 72 hours and counting, her eyes mapped with red veins, her lab floor covered in printed datasheets because she didn't trust screens when things mattered this much. The rift's communication wasn't language. It was something worse, something better. It was a compressed physics model, an entire operating system for technology so far beyond the assembly's capabilities that comparing the two was like comparing a campfire to a star. The model contained instructions, blueprints, specifications for energy systems, propulsion methods, and structural engineering that made everything in the known galaxy look like children stacking blocks. But the model was incomplete. Not damaged, not degraded by time, intentionally incomplete. There were gaps in the blueprint shaped like questions, empty spaces that required a specific kind of answer, a specific kind of thinking, lateral, irrational, the kind of thinking that jumps from A to D without visiting B or C and arrives at the right answer for the wrong reasons. Human thinking. Eunji sat on the floor of her lab, surrounded by data, and understood something that made her chest feel hollow. The rift had not been looking for the smartest species in the galaxy. It had been looking for the weirdest one. The one that thought sideways. The one that built FTL drives out of garbage because someone told them they couldn't. The one that treated impossible as a starting condition rather than a conclusion. The rift had been looking for humanity, and it had been looking for a very, very long time. She called Do-hyun. He came down to the lab in his sleep clothes, which on the Baekdu meant the same clothes as everything else, but with the boots off. He stood in the doorway and looked at the data sheets on the floor, and the woman sitting among them, like a monk in a paper garden. "How bad?" he asked. "It's not bad," Unji said. "It's not anything I have a word for." She pointed at the central display. The rift was built by a species that existed before the assembly, before anyone. They seeded the galaxy with intelligent life, and then they left, and they left this behind. "A test," Do-hyun said. "A door, with a lock that only works for a very specific kind of mind." She looked at him. "The lock is shaped like us." Do-hyun said nothing for a long time. The ship hummed around them, that low, constant vibration of systems, held together by willpower and welding. "What does it need?" he asked. "A response. The blueprint has gaps. I need to fill them, but I can't do it from out here. The transmission delay through normal space distorts the data. I need to interface with it directly. From inside the rift. From inside the rift." The silence between them was the kind that holds weight. Unji watched Do-hyun's face and saw the calculation happening. Not math, but something older. Risk against purpose, duty against reason. The same equation every captain makes when the safe choice and the right choice stop being the same thing. While they stood in that silence, the assembly was tearing itself apart. Fragments of Unji's findings had leaked. Not the full picture. Enough. Enough for the isolationist bloc to call an emergency session and demand an immediate vote to re-quarantine Earth. Their argument was simple and old and effective. Humans were dangerous. Humans with precursor technology would be catastrophic. Lock them back in the box before it was too late. Speaker Leowen fought the motion. Spent political capital, like a man paying off a debt he knew he couldn't cover. Delayed the vote by 6 hours, then 12, buying time that was running out. On Earth, No Sorum received the news about the emergency session and the re-quarantine vote while eating cold noodles in her office at 4 in the morning. She put down her chopsticks, read the briefing twice, then called her speechwriter and told him to go home. She would write this one herself. She stood before the assembly 12 hours later. The chamber was full, every delegation present. The broadcast was live to 312 worlds. The isolationist bloc sat with the rigid posture of people who had already made their decision. The hegemony bloc lounged with the confidence of people waiting to profit from whatever happened. Sorum didn't beg, didn't threaten, didn't raise her voice. She talked about the blackout years, the decade after quarantine when Earth's power grids collapsed, because half their infrastructure had been tied to assembly supply chains that were severed overnight. She talked about hospitals going dark, crops failing, the number, quiet and enormous, of people who died not from war or violence, but from the simple administrative fact that their civilization had been unplugged. She talked about children. Children who grew up being told the stars were something that happened to other people. Children who looked at the night sky and saw a locked door. She talked about all of this in the same tone she used for everything. Flat, steady. The voice of a woman who had learned a long time ago that emotion was a card you played once and then it was gone. Then she said, "You locked us in a room and called it mercy. We built a window. Now there's something on the other side of the glass, and it's asking for us. Not you, us." She paused, let the silence do its work. "You can vote to put us back in the room. But the thing at the window isn't going to stop knocking just because you're afraid of who answers. Not cancelled. Delayed. It was enough." On the Baekdu, Captain Yoon Do-hyun made a decision that would end his career or save a galaxy. He was unclear on which, and found that he didn't care about the distinction as much as he probably should have. He ordered the ship into the rift. Not near it, not to its edge. Into it. Lieutenant Baekji Som received the order at his tactical station. He looked at it, looked at Do-hyun, did not ask if the captain was sure, because the question would have been an insult. He strapped in, checked his readings, and said, "About time." The Baekdu entered the rift at 03:47 hours, ship time. Every assembly vessel in the system watched it happen. The comms channels filled with shouting in 60 languages. Leowen, watching from the assembly station, pressed all 6 hands flat against the observation window and held them there. Inside the rift, physics was not broken. The Baekdu's instruments screamed and recalibrated and screamed again. Colors existed that shouldn't have. Distances meant something different. Time moved like water in a bathtub, sloshing, uneven. Unji activated her transmitter. The device was a thing of beauty and madness, built from assembly parts, human engineering, and 3 components she had fabricated herself, using a theory she hadn't finished proving. It worked. She didn't know why. She suspected the rift was helping. The interface lasted 7 minutes from the crew's perspective. Outside in normal space, 3 days passed. Assembly ships circled the rift's mouth, waiting and arguing and waiting some more. When the Baekdu emerged, it looked the same. Same battered hull, same visible welds, same patch job on the port side that Do-hyun had done himself 6 years ago with a torch and a bad mood. They ran on principles that the assembly's best scientists would spend decades trying to understand. The engines were quiet. The sensors reached farther. Something fundamental had shifted inside the ship's architecture, like a house that had been rewired in the walls. And Unji was holding a data core. Not just the blueprint anymore, a map. A complete map of a network that spanned the galaxy. Thousands of nodes, hidden in asteroid fields and planetary cores, and empty stretches of space that nobody had thought to look at twice. Each node was a piece of precursor technology. Each was keyed to human cognition. Each was waiting. She held the data core in both hands and felt the weight of it, not physical but real, the weight of every locked door opening at once. Admiral Ha Tae-gun received Do-hyun's transmission in his office on Earth. He listened to the full report. He looked at the fleet readiness numbers he had been quietly updating for weeks. He leaned back in his chair. "They quarantined the key," he said to no one. "They locked up the one species that could open the door, and then they spent 60 years wondering why the door wouldn't open." The first precursor node unfolded like a metal flower blooming in the vacuum of space. And every species watching understood that the galaxy had just changed owners. The node had been hiding inside an asteroid field in neutral territory, dormant for longer than any civilization in the assembly had existed. When the Baekdu transmitted the activation signal, the asteroid cracked open, and the structure inside woke up. Petals of dark metal spread outward, each one the size of a city, each one humming with energy that registered on sensors but defied measurement. The rift fragment in that sector closed. Not slowly, not in stages. It sealed like a wound, remembering how to be skin. One moment, the dimensional tear was there, bleeding wrong light into normal space. The next, it was gone. Stars visible behind where it had been. Clean sky. The assembly fleet watched in the kind of silence that follows the last note of something enormous. Lieutenant Baek Ji-song sat at his console on the Baekdu's bridge and watched the node's petals finish their unfolding. He felt something shift inside his chest, a tightness releasing that he hadn't known was there. On his personal terminal, behind 3 layers of encryption, he had kept a file for 9 years. A list. Every species that had voted for humanity's quarantine. Names, dates, delegation numbers. He called it historical interest. Everyone who knew about it called it something else. He looked at the node, looked at the file, closed it. He didn't delete it. That would have been a lie. But he closed it, and closing it was enough for now. On 312 worlds, the broadcast of the node's activation played on every available screen. Commentary ranged from awe to terror, depending on who was talking and what they stood to lose. The assembly's 3 factions moved fast. The hegemony bloc sent envoys to Earth within hours. Their offer was clean and brutal: an alliance. Humanity's precursor technology in exchange for shared military supremacy over the assembly. Together, they said, humans and the hegemony could reshape galactic governance. They used words like partnership and mutual benefit, and avoided words like dominance and subjugation. But the shape of the sentence was the same, regardless of which words you put in it. The isolationist bloc sent their own envoys. Their offer was more polished: full reparations, immediate membership, a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing. In exchange, humanity would share the precursor network openly. All species, equal access. The fact that equal access to human-keyed technology would require human operators, effectively making humanity an employee of the assembly rather than an equal, was left in the margins, where they hoped no one would look. The reformists sent Leowen, alone, with no offer. Leowen sat across from No Sorum in a small room on the assembly station and said, "What do you want?" Sorum looked at the Tassari diplomat for a long time. Leowen's bioluminescence was dim. The patterns were irregular, not performing, just present. The light of a creature that was tired of pretending things were manageable. "I'll tell you when we figure it out," Sorum said. Earth figured it out the hard way. For the first time since the quarantine, the United Earth Council opened a global question to the public. The question was simple. The answers were not. What do we do with this? The debate cracked the planet open, not violently, deeply. Families who had lost people in the blackout years wanted the assembly to pay in ways that couldn't be measured in currency. Scientists wanted collaboration. Students wanted the stars. Military leaders wanted leverage. Philosophers wanted to talk about it for another decade. Everyone had an opinion. Nobody had the same one. Admiral Ha Taegun stood before the council in a session that was broadcast to every city on Earth. He was 52, gray at the temples. His brother had died in the third year of the blackout, in a hospital that lost power at 2 in the morning and couldn't get it back. Taegun carried that fact the way people carry old injuries, not with a limp, but with a carefulness that never fully went away. He said, 60 years ago, they decided our future without asking us. If we do the same to them, we become what they were afraid of. He paused, and they were afraid of us for the wrong reasons. Let's give them the right ones. The room was quiet after that. The kind of quiet that happens when a large number of people are thinking the same thing, and not saying it, because saying it would make it real, and they aren't ready for it to be real yet. No Sorum presented humanity's terms to the full assembly 3 days later. She stood at the podium that was becoming hers by habit, and looked out at 312 delegations who had spent 60 years pretending Earth didn't exist, and were now sitting very still, because Earth held the only key to their survival. She didn't ask for revenge. She didn't ask for supremacy. She asked for restructuring. The quarantine power, the ability for any coalition of species to vote to lock a developing civilization inside its own system, was to be abolished. Permanently. No exceptions, no emergency provisions. Gone. The precursor network would be administered by a new body with human oversight, open to all species, but no longer subject to assembly majority vote. The body that locked you in a cage doesn't get to run the key. And any species, anywhere in the galaxy, that independently developed faster than light travel would receive automatic representation. No vote, no application, no approval process. You build the engine, you get the seat. You don't get to decide who's ready, Sorum said. Nobody does. That's the point. The reformists voted yes immediately. The isolationists voted yes after 4 hours of closed-door negotiation, during which Sorum reportedly said nothing for 3 hours and 50 minutes, and then spoke for 10 minutes, and the isolationists came out looking like they had seen their own math turned against them. The hegemony bloc voted no. 3 hegemony warships moved to blockade the nearest precursor node within the hour. Heavy cruisers, fully armed, positioned between the node and the Bekdu's approach vector. Their message was simple. This technology belongs to whoever controls it, and control comes from the barrel of a weapon. Captain Yoon Do-hyun was dispatched to respond. The Bekdu arrived at the blockade, looking the way it always looked, like a ship that had been built in a garage by someone with more conviction than resources. The hegemony cruisers dwarfed it. Their weapon systems alone outmassed the Bekdu's entire hull. Ji-song ran the tactical assessment. The numbers were bad, not impossible, because the Bekdu's precursor-enhanced systems changed the math in ways the hegemony didn't understand yet, but bad enough that winning would cost something. Do-hyun opened a communication channel. The hegemony commander appeared on screen, tall, armored, the posture of someone who had built a career on the assumption that power was the only language that translated without loss. Do-hyun looked at the commander and spoke with the voice of a man who had spent 20 years building a ship so he could see stars he was told he didn't deserve. "I'm not going to start a war in front of them," he said. He meant the stars. The commander understood this somehow, despite the fact that such a sentence should not have translated across species. "Stand down," Do-hyun said. "Go home. Tell your people we're not what you were afraid of." The hegemony commander hesitated. Not because of the threat. There was no threat. The absence of a threat from a species that held absolute technological superiority was more frightening than any weapon, because it meant they had chosen something other than force, and the hegemony commander did not have a protocol for that. The warships stood down. That night, Speaker Leowen sat alone in the empty assembly chamber. The lights were low. The seats were vacant. The bioluminescence on Leowen's skin had faded to almost nothing, a dim blue glow that barely reached the edges of the room. A reformist aide entered quietly, asked if Leowen was all right. Leowen sat in the dark of the largest political chamber in the galaxy and said, "We quarantined them because they were dangerous." The aide nodded. Leowen's light flickered once. "We were right. We just had the definition wrong." The nodes opened one by one across the galaxy like eyes waking from a long sleep. The Bekdu led the activation fleet. 27 human ships, built from the same scrap metal stubbornness as the original, now running on precursor-enhanced systems that made assembly engineers weep into their instruments. Alongside them flew reformist vessels, assembly ships that had broken from the old coalition to be part of whatever was coming next. The fleet was small. It was enough. Each precursor node was different. Some hid in asteroid fields. Some slept inside dead moons. One had been sitting at the bottom of a gas giant's atmosphere for longer than the assembly's oldest member species had existed, waiting in the crushing dark like a seed that had never lost faith in spring. When activated, each node did the same thing. Stabilized its sector, closed any rift fragments, opened a communication channel that worked instantaneously across any distance, signals traveling through dimensional layers that normal physics couldn't touch. For the first time in galactic history, a message sent from one edge of the galaxy arrived at the other edge at the same moment. No delay, no degradation, no cost. The galaxy, stitched together by bureaucracy and trade routes and the slow crawl of light-speed communication for 10,000 years, was suddenly and totally connected. Ji-song coordinated the activations from the Bekdu's bridge. He had a map on his main display, the whole galaxy rendered in light, and each time a node came online, a new point appeared, a new star that wasn't a star, but something older and more deliberate. He watched them multiply, system by system, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Some things only needed to be seen. The final node was at the galactic core. hidden in the radiation storm and gravitational chaos that surrounded the supermassive black hole at the center of everything. No assembly ship had ever gone there. No human ship had either. Until now. The Baekdu made the approach alone. Do-hyun's decision. The fleet held position at the core's edge and watched the small, battered ship, with its visible welds and patch-job hull, descend into the most violent region of space in the galaxy, like it was pulling into a parking spot. Eunji activated the final node from her lab. The interface was different this time, stronger. The node didn't just respond, it reached back. The precursor network, now complete, presented its question. Not in words, not in any language Eunji recognized. In a model, a simulation rendered directly into her consciousness, bypassing screens and speakers and every intermediary between information and understanding. She saw futures, thousands of them, branching from this moment like roots from a tree, spreading in every direction, each one a different answer to the same question. The simulation showed her isolation, species hoarding the network, using it for advantage, letting the old patterns repeat with new technology. She saw wars fought at the speed of thought. She saw quarantines enforced not by committee, but by whoever controlled the nodes. She saw the galaxy, connected and divided at the same time, using the precursor's gift to build bigger, faster cages. Then it showed her the other path. Connection without control. Access without ownership. The vulnerability of being truly known by species that had every reason to fear you, and choosing to be known anyway. And underneath both visions, like a watermark in the fabric of the simulation, the precursor's own story. They had faced this same choice. A species so advanced they could have ruled the galaxy for eternity. Built the network, hid the nodes, keyed the lock to the species most likely to understand what it meant to be locked out. Then they vanished. Their question was simple. It was the only question that mattered. Will you stay? Eunji opened her eyes. The lab was quiet. The data core in her hands was warm. She looked at it for a long time, feeling the weight of a choice that didn't belong to her alone. She routed the question to every activated node. Every ship, every planet in range, every orbital station and deep space outpost, and research vessel, and colony world, and forgotten mining platform at the edge of nothing. Not just humans, everyone. Assembly species who had voted for quarantine, and assembly species who had fought against it, and species who had never heard of Earth, and species who had been watching with interest, and species who were too busy surviving to care about galactic politics, but cared about this. The question went out. The answers came back. They were not unanimous. They were not clean. They were messy and contradictory and passionate and confused. Some said stay. Some said leave. Some said they didn't understand the question. Some answered with anger. Some answered with hope. A few answered with poetry, which Eunji hadn't expected and couldn't explain. She fed it all back into the network. Every voice, every contradiction, every answer that disagreed with every other answer. The network accepted it, not because the answer was correct. There was no correct answer. The network accepted it because the answer was collective. Because the whole point, the entire architectural philosophy of a species that had built a galaxy-spanning network and then walked away from it, was that no single voice should decide. The precursors hadn't left to abandon the galaxy. They had left because staying meant their voice would always be the loudest, and they believed the answer should come from everyone or from no one at all. The galaxy reorganized. Not overnight, not smoothly. The assembly didn't dissolve. It evolved, painfully, the way all institutions evolve when the ground shifts beneath them. The quarantine power was abolished. The precursor network became the backbone of a new system, decentralized, open, imperfect. No species could be locked out. No coalition could decide who was ready. The cost of connection was vulnerability. Every species on the network was visible, known. exposed in ways that made old powers uncomfortable and young civilizations giddy. Privacy became a negotiation, not a right. Trust became the only currency that worked at galactic scale. Nosorum oversaw the transition from a small office on the assembly station that she had claimed by the simple method of sitting in it until people started bringing her documents. She worked 18-hour days, drank too much tea, argued with delegates from species whose names she couldn't pronounce, and whose biology she didn't understand, and whose political concerns she addressed with the same flat patience she had brought to every negotiation since Busan. A journalist asked her, during a rare public appearance, what humanity wanted from the galaxy now. Sorum considered the question. She had a habit of considering questions the way other people considered loaded weapons, with attention and respect, and a healthy understanding of what they could do if mishandled. Neighbors, she said, just neighbors. We've had enough of being alone. On the Baekdu, the refit offer arrived via official channel. Precursor grade systems, new hull plating, engine upgrades that would make the ship faster, stronger, and more beautiful than anything in the fleet. Captain Yoon Do-hyun declined. His crew asked why. Some of them had been with him since the beginning, since the days of cutting metal in a hidden shipyard on the far side of the moon, building in secret, dreaming in defiance. Do-hyun ran his hand along a welded seam in the bulkhead. The seam was rough, uneven. He had done it himself, 12 years ago, in the middle of the night, using a torch that kept flickering because the power supply was unreliable. He remembered the heat, the sparks, the way his hands shook, not from fear, but from the focused intensity of a man building the only thing that mattered to him. "This is what we built, when nobody believed we could," he said. "I want to remember what that felt like." The Baekdu jumped to FTL. The stars stretched. The quarantine was over, and the ship that had been built to prove it could be done was still flying, still patched, still held together by the stubborn conviction that a locked door is just a problem that hasn't been solved yet. 6 months later, on the edge of known space, a precursor node that no one had cataloged sent a ping. It was old, older than the others. Its surface was dark, pitted by radiation, worn smooth by time measured in numbers that didn't fit comfortably in human mathematics. It bore a single inscription on its outer shell, carved in a language that no living species in the galaxy could read. Dr. Shin Eun-ji received the ping in her quarters on the Baekdu, where she had remained as the ship's chief scientist despite multiple offers from universities, research stations, and 3 different governments. She analyzed the ping, translated the inscription from the data echo embedded in the signal. It read, "You answered. Now come find us." She sat with those words for a long time. The lab was dark. The ship was quiet. Outside the viewport, the stars burned with the steady patience of things that have always been there, waiting for someone to reach them. She didn't tell anyone. Not yet. She booked passage on the Baekdu's next deep space run. She packed light. 1 bag, the data core. A photograph she kept folded in her jacket pocket, creased from years of carrying, showing a little girl standing in a field in Daejeon, looking up at a night sky full of stars she had been told she would never visit. The beginning of something bigger.